Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the One Hood Power Hour. I am your co-host, Kahari Mosley, here with my illustrious co-host, Miracle Jones.
Yes, it's a good, end of a rainy Monday here in Pittsburgh, but it's great to be here. And we have a very exciting show for you this evening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Before we get into our special guest, we will give you a sneak preview. We have Stephen Caruso from Spotlight PA and John Micek from the PA Capital Star. We're going to be talking all things statewide Pennsylvania midterm politics, the governor's race, the Senate race, key congressional races, and other House and Senate races at the Pennsylvania House and Senate level as well, if we can get there. But so much to talk about. Two very esteemed guests will be joining us in a few minutes. But before we get to that, Miracle, what are some of the headlines out there that we need to be paying attention to?
So unfortunately, start off on a little bit of a negative. People's been really paying attention to what's going on in the Caribbean island, Puerto Rico, even to Pakistan, as there has been unprecedented levels of flooding, hurricanes abroad, and people have been talking about the amounts of flooding and natural disaster that's been happening over the past couple of weeks. Of course, it is hurricane season, and this is something that people think about, every year. But given the fact that we already saw Puerto Rico go through a devastating hurricane a couple of years ago, and then we were trying to support and help with the rebuilding effort because there are so many people in Allegheny County who have connections to Puerto Rico. And then for people to wake up yesterday and be told that the whole island has zero power and that people were going through needing support and resources, been just very devastating. And so a lot of people have been working, of course, here locally with the universities to try to provide aid and support to the people of Puerto Rico as well as the people of Pakistan. So it's just a reminder that with everything happening, this adverse weather is really impacting people. And that's why people are really having to take environmental concerns very seriously because it is just creating devastation across the globe.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's very important to keep that in mind, and I thought definitely our hearts are with the folks in Puerto Rico, as well as in other parts of the world that are seeing the impact of this extreme weather. One thing I did want to mention more on the local front, yesterday we participated in an event called Protecting Our Freedom with Pennsylvania United, as well as Bend the Arc Jewish Action. And it was an event where we had candidates who are running for office, as well as some local elected officials speaking to a group of volunteers who were going out to canvass on behalf of many of the candidates who were there, as well as some other candidates who were not there. And I thought it was a great event. Josh Shapiro was in the house. We also had Mayor Ed Gainey provide a very rousing speech in his introduction of gubernatorial candidate Josh Shapiro. We also had a congressional candidate Chris DeLuzio, State Representative Summer Lee, who's also running for Congress, as well as a State Senator Lindsey Williams, who's running for re-election in her city of Pittsburgh and northern suburban seat. So really a great event. Miracle, any reflections you have of yesterday's event, Protecting Our Freedom?
Yeah, it's just been a very interesting election season, I think, for a lot of people watching what's going on, across the political spectrum that understand that Pennsylvania is really at the heart of so many issues. Over the weekend, there was another draft release of proposed anti-abortion legislation coming down that would make it a felony to even educate people about their rights to an abortion or how to secure an abortion. And again, here in Pennsylvania, we have become, particularly after Ohio and West Virginia, severely limited abortion, it has really come home here to Pennsylvania. And so having elected officials, people running for office, really speak to these issues and how these issues impact not only Pennsylvania, but people across the country is very important. And for those to understand like how these issues not only impact people's ability to make a living, but their abilities to go to work, to get to take care of their families, to access education. It's very important that you have elected officials coming out and sharing their message. And again, we invite a lot of folks to these forums, these events, and the people who show up are the people who are really trying to make sure that their message is being shared and that they create an environment where all people are included. And so having events like yesterday was really fun. It was outside. It was a nice day to be outside, a nice day to canvas and to learn and talk to people about their issues, about what they're fighting for, about why they're running. And it's always a positive when you can bring the community to the politicians and the politicians to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And also want to give a shout out to State Representative Sarah Inamorata, who joined us for the Sunday night sit down that also aired this morning. City Controller Michael Lamb was in the house. County Councilwoman Bethany Hallam was also in the house. So it was a really great collection of leaders as well as activists who were going out, knocking on doors right before the Steeler game. We try to plan it a certain kind of way so that we didn't interfere with the Steelers Patriot game. But I guess the way the game went, maybe a lot of Steelers fans wouldn't have mind a knock at the door to take them away from their frustration as they watch the television. So moving to actually a story that we talked about as it was breaking on last week's show. There's really been just a lot of reverberations throughout the political universe about the article that was initially in the Rolling Stone, and it was a video from a Zoom meeting a week before the insurrection, where Doug Mastriano, made a prayer for that Trump and MAGA to seize power, and it's really been spreading again, like I said, all over the political universe. But it really broke last Monday as we were on the air. So, now that we have, learned more about the story, at least more than we knew when we were on the air last week, America, or any additional thoughts, about, this story that's really, made its way to not even in the political world, but, in mainstream media.
Unfortunately, Pennsylvania really is at the heart of a lot of these issues. I don't want to steal the phrase like "as Pennsylvania goes the world," but there is a real conversation about the tone of people's rhetorics when it comes to running for office, how it has become more personal. And as it becomes more personalized, some of the things that people are leading with is this rhetoric that really cements extreme religious ideology that has, people saying that there is a higher power that not only dictates how they're running, but how they're making political decisions that impact people. And so having people do a prayer for the seizure of power, a lot of people had questions about, what does that mean for free and fair elections? What does that mean as we go and expand Ep.87? And unfortunately, the campaign really hasn't been too responsive to some of these questions. But as we're looking at what's happening, whether it's stuff that's happening, with some far right people going winning in Europe or even South and Latin America, it was really important that we have these conversations and try to figure out like who is included in this seizure of power, whose voices and votes are included, and what does it mean. Again, every candidate has the right to have, to express and share their religious viewpoints, and has the right to go to various groups and participate in electoral outreach and organizing. But I think just for a lot of folks, just that seizure of power line is just concerning, because what does it mean to take power away from people who voted in this instance against what you stand for? What does it mean to take power? What is it? Is it an act of violence, or is it just going through the electoral process? And unfortunately, the Mastriano campaign really hasn't been too forthcoming about what they mean, how they're engaging, and why they are associating with some of these groups who people have called extremist and white supremacist leaning.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a question that a lot of folks are asking, even some candidates out on the campaign trail. So now we are here for the moment that you've all waited for those who've been following our promotions throughout the week, that we are going to be joined by two esteemed political journalists who are really at the pulse of what's happening in these statewide races, and also just the dynamics, across the political landscape here in the state of Pennsylvania. We are happy to invite once again back to the Power Hour John Micek from the Pennsylvania Capital Star and Stephen Caruso from Spotlight PA. Welcome back to the Power Hour.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you back. So I guess let's start. We were talking right before the show started. We'll start with Governor. I know, Stephen, you've been really, following the governor's race, and I'm sure John's going to have a lot of thoughts about the governor's race too. But let's start with you, Stephen. You've been following the governor's race. You said you were recently in Gettysburg at an event. What is the state of the race, today, September 29th, 2022?
Yeah, so where we're kind of at right now is, polling shows Shapiro with a lead. But, polling has not been the most accurate, particularly, I think, with trying to judge Republican enthusiasm or predicting what voter turnout is going to look like. But, what we can say about this race, though, is, it's a midterm with a Democratic president in office. So that kind of is something you have to give the Republicans. Shapiro also has a huge amount of money. We're going to see more Campaign 5 reports coming out next week, in fact. So I'll be looking really closely at that. But Shapiro has had the most money so far, and money doesn't buy you an election, but sure can make it a lot easier. And to kind of step back, the reason this is such an important race, that there's going to get a lot of attention and there's going to be tons of money flowing in. The reason Shapiro's raised $15-16 million, if not more, is just because the governor is a very powerful position. They're going to dictate the budget. They're going to be signing bills into law or vetoing bills from becoming law on abortion, on guns, on education, on policing, on all sorts of things, on the minimum wage. So, it's a really important position. Also going to be a boss for, every state employee, state troopers, environmental inspectors, and they're also going to have control of this really big administrative state that can make a lot of changes just kind of on his own. So it's a really important position for the state, obviously, and there's a whole lot of powers, I think, where we kind of really saw from Governor Wolf being governor, just during the COVID pandemic. We kind of really saw how important the governor can be, and now that's up for grabs in this really swingy state in a big election year where I kind of don't believe anyone who says they know exactly what's going to happen, because what we've seen in the last couple of years, at least 2020, a lot of people thought they had it figured out, and then there was this huge amount of turnout from people. No one expected to vote across the state. So kind of the state of the race is, polling says Shapiro has a slight lead, but there's a couple weeks still to go. There are quite a few weeks still to go, quite a few days. I think it's 50 days mark just passed. So we'll kind of see what happens.
John, what are you saying from your vantage point in this governor's race?
I am with Stephen on this one, Kohari. I got out of the predicting business in 2016. Certainly, this is a race that seems to be going Josh Shapiro's way. At the moment, we're seeing polling, though, the Trafalgar poll out just this morning that shows the race within the margin, suggesting that just the volatility of this campaign. I mean, I will say though that I don't recall a race in recent memory where we've been struck by such a binary between the two candidates. In Josh Shapiro, you have sort of this traditionalist Democrat in the sort of the left traditional liberal Tom Wolfe mode. In Doug Mastriano, you have this next phase in the evolution of the Republican Party, going from the MAGA movement of former President Donald Trump and sort of taking it to the next level, as we've seen with politicians such as U.S. Rep. Lauren Boebert out of Colorado, or Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, really leaning into that sort of MAGA pose, really leaning into that. And while he says he's not a Christian nationalist, he's certainly embraced that segment of the party. So in a lot of ways, voters are going to be presented with a very stark choice on election day. And as Stephen said a couple of minutes ago, things seem to be going Josh Shapiro's way at the moment. But 50 some odd days is a lifetime in politics, and a lot can and probably will change.
Yeah, if I were to jump in, I'd kind of like co-sign what John said. It's like we just did a voter guide at Spotlight, and the candidates, it's like sometimes there's some overlap where you find an issue where it's like, oh, they kind of agree on this, and we went down for a dozen issues, and everyone's pretty different on pretty much everything: minimum wage, how to treat education, how to treat guns, abortion, obviously, and whatever Josh Shapiro says, Doug Mastriano is basically the opposite.
Thank you. To you, Miracle.
Yeah, and we're seeing very competitive races. Some people would say for the first time in a couple of years, obviously this is the biggest test after redistricting. And so when you're out traveling with some of these candidates, or you're going to hear some of these stump speeches, have you noticed a difference in what they are addressing? Because usually it's like, my opponent wants to do this, I'm going to do this. But it seems that some of these politicians are getting very, very personal. Has that been something you've been noticing while on the campaign trail?
I have. I would just say, yeah, really quickly. I have noticed that. I was out in Pittsburgh last weekend, or maybe it was 2 weekends ago, and from Democrats, they're basically saying my opponent's an extremist. Talking about abortion, talking about voting rights, on these issues. The word extremist gets thrown out, and same thing. I end up calling a pro-life PAC leader in Western PA, and he was saying, well, no, we're not extremists. In fact, the Democrats are extremists because their position on abortion. There hasn't been a lot of nuance, I would say, in the political conversation.
Yeah, I guess I'd add to that. Our Peter Hall, who's been covering this race most directly, has been to a couple of Mastriano events over the last couple of weeks, and the Mastriano, a senator from Franklin County, has hewed pretty much to type, talking about has repeated his baseless claims of election fraud. He's promised to sort of reform schools and to take a look at the election code and all the sort of things that he's been talking about so far. Pretty standard kind of Mastriano talking points, and as Stephen says, not a heck of a lot of nuance here.
Thank you for that. Miracle, did you have a follow-up?
I did, because you were talking about the coverage of the Mastriano campaign. This has also been one of the toughest, campaigns to really try to interview everyone, try to talk to everyone based, because, we do try to have engagement with every single candidate, but there has been some conversations of the lack of access to Mastriano. And I know, John, you said you have somebody covering his campaigns, but how do you navigate that fear of some of the media that the campaign has and trying to report and share like accurate information.
Yeah, I mean, the Mastriano campaign, its standard default is not to talk to members of, for lack of a better term, the mainstream press. He does interviews with conservative talk radio. He does interviews with conservative broadcast outlets, and those of us sort of in the legacy media who are trying to cover this campaign don't get a lot in the way of access or conversation. In a way, we almost sort of defaulted to, well, the Mastriano campaign couldn't be reached for comment. It's almost like Control M for that phrase to come up in our copy now. But Miracle, in a lot of ways, that does the voters a disservice. You have a man, while he is avowedly conservative, is running to be governor of all 13 million Pennsylvanians, not just the governor of his base, but has chosen in a very specific way to speak to those outlets where he is more likely to be unchallenged in his assertions and to get sort of some hosannas from those he is talking to as well, and that really doesn't augur well, I think, for the state of our conversation.
Thank you. And Stephen, you had a reaction, so did you want to, add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think John nailed it. I would say I've even found it at the bottom of the ticket, though. Like when I was out in Pittsburgh, I was trying to get in touch with Republican candidates to try and do what I do, go to events, talk to voters, maybe go out door knocking, and I found it quite hard. And I finally bumped into one of the Republican candidates I was trying to track down at a public event, and they seemed to always just be coming up with reasons not to talk to me at the time. And look, I understand that they said I could give them a call at a later date, and like that's fine, I'll do that. But I found this kind of up and down, and it's even kind of happening in the Capitol. Like it's just been getting harder and harder to get. Mostly we're talking about Republican lawmakers on record about certain things, but just overall, I think even with John Fetterman, he's stopped taking really gaggle. Like he stopped. A normal thing would be after an event for a lawmaker to step aside, or an important politician to step aside and take a few questions. Not even saying that stand there for more than like 3 minutes. We get people on schedules, but take a few. And John Fetterman hasn't really been doing that, particularly since his stroke. And there's a lot of health issues to get into that, and that makes it tricky. But I think there's a lot of politicians who are realizing they can kind of just build their brand on themselves through press releases, social media, and cable TV, and not engage with the media that might not ask them the exact question they want to get.
John, are you seeing the same phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, if I could pivot to the Senate race for just a moment. I know we're not talking about that yet, but I mean, it came out just last week that Mr. Fetterman, who did, as Stephen said, suffered a stroke just before the May primary, is now not going to debate probably until well into October, which is when, that's deep into mail-in balloting season. It's just a couple of weeks out from Election Day. And I get it on one level. When you are running in a nationally watched race that's as high stakes as the Fetterman's or as the U.S. Senate campaign is, you want to minimize your exposure. You want to minimize any potential for a slip of the tongue or sort of an infelicitous moment in front of the camera that your opponent can cut into commercials. But again, this is going to be happening as tens of thousands of Pennsylvanians presumably start casting their mail-in ballots and will be deprived of an opportunity to watch these two candidates square off. And it does go, I think, as Stephen said a moment ago, to the changing shape of our campaigns these days. I can't open up my email without getting a blast from either the Fetterman campaign or the Oz campaign or the Josh Shapiro campaign, appealing directly to their base, transmitting their message directly to their base. So they've discovered effective ways to go around the campaign beat reporters who've been covering these races. But at the same time, voters, I think, are getting an incomplete picture of who these candidates are and where they stand.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah. One of the questions that I have for both of you, I guess this round we can go, John, then Stephen. How has this phenomenon changed the nature of covering races? How is it changing? The work that you do, that you've done in the past. What does this new dynamic do to change? The traditional interaction between, journalists who cover the political landscape and the candidates and the elected officials who operate in the arena.
Oh, if you're trying to make me feel old, Gahari, you have succeeded mightily there. I kid. I mean, my first campaign in the state was covering Ed Rendell 1 back in 2002. Who, in a lot of ways, we couldn't get rid of him. So there was that, I suppose. But I mean, it is more access is always better than less. Certainly, the campaigns and their handlers have different feelings about that. But the more time you spend around a candidate, the more time you spend around campaigns, you get a more nuanced understanding of who that person is and how he or she might react in a time of crisis, of how he or she might govern based on their past records. I mean, where we are now with these very self-contained campaigns, with these very tightly managed candidates who rarely, if ever, stray off message, who rarely exhibit a face that is not, I think, carefully manicured. You're robbed of a lot of those opportunities. And of course, I mean, they're not there to do us any favors, of course. They're there to run and win. But I think by putting up those walls, by being that much more self-contained, that again, voters aren't presented with as full a picture of these candidates. They're presented with much more tightly stage managed public images. They're presented with much more tightly stage managed messages, and these candidates now, thanks to email and thanks to Facebook Live, thanks to any other social media channel, can go directly around campaign beat reporters to deliver the carefully tailored message that they want to voters. And while that may work politically to their advantage, and while that may win campaigns, I am not sure necessarily that it results in a more informed populace.
Yeah, and I think what I'd say is, like, what I think about a lot is, particularly from the governor's race perspective, Mastriano, like, we're seeing him run a race where, yeah, he is mostly stuck to his own. He doesn't often do interviews outside of that circle that John described. He rose on Facebook Live videos, literally, like there started to first be posts. I started noticing them in 2020 of people saying Mastriano for governor, because he did these Facebook Live videos during the beginning of the pandemic, during the lockdown phase, where he would talk to people. He's a deeply Christian person. His Christianity is all over his campaign. And he would have these rants on Facebook where he'd talk about faith, he talked about his politics, he talked about his distrust of, slowly started getting the distrust of the science, the media, Democrats, and that built this fandom. So all this to say, like, he's used to speaking to that sort of the echo chamber. And now what happens if he becomes governor? And, what is a governor Mastriano going to do? How are the reporters of the Capitol, how are we going to get information out of him? How are, his colleagues in the General Assembly going to get information out of him? It does create a real challenge, I think, for, even beyond the election, of, like, if this is how people run their campaigns, I think we have to assume this is going to how they're going to communicate in office. And so it's also like, what does government by Facebook Live or Twitter meme look like? And I think is something I'm thinking about a lot.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I have joked with colleagues that if we want to know what a Governor Mastriano might be thinking about, we will have to watch Newsmax or One American News, or listen to him on any number of conservative chat shows. And while it's easy to be glib about that, friends, I mean, Stephen raises an excellent point. Being the chief executive of a state, being a United States senator, is an order of magnitude of difference between from being a candidate. When you're a candidate, you're appealing to a very specific constituency, whomever your base is. When you are a United States senator, you represent the whole of the Commonwealth. When you are elected governor, you are the governor of the whole of the Commonwealth, not the U.S. senator of your, and I'm going to sound like a broken record here, not the U.S. senator of your base or the governor of your base. And I share Stephen's very genuine concerns about what a potential Mastriano administration could look like and what that would mean trying to cover them even on the most fundamental of matters if access is going to be as challenging then as it is now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, those are really, really interesting points. Yeah, my mind it's been as I'm thinking about it. It now, you know, we see that that's how the Mastriano campaign is addressing the media. Are we seeing a similar playbook with the Oz campaign, or is it a different you know, level of engagement going on between the media and the Oz campaign?
I mean, I'm not having been out in the field. I can only speak to it anecdotally. It looks like Mehmet Oz is holding sort of traditional candidate style events. He's held town halls. He's held public events. I've seen the advisories for those events in my emails. He has in some ways looked a lot more like a traditional candidate, and you know that compares to John Fetterman, who admittedly comes to the table with some medical challenges. He was benched for many weeks by a stroke that was, as it appears, far more serious than he initially let on, and he's only now recently returned to the campaign trail with a handful of events. But I mean, even in those events, from what I've been able to glean, those have been pretty tightly managed as well.
Stephen, any reflections on that?
Mostly what John has said, but yeah, seems like Oz does a lot of press events. You know, we'll see. We'll see what happens in the closing stretch.
Yeah, and going, back to you, John, because you said that like you can't really meme an election, but for one thing that's been very, very heavy is the use of social media in this campaign season, particularly within the Twitter sphere with the Senate campaign, because they're always going back and forth and really responding to each other directly on social media. And so as we're seeing kind of like this switch in real time, coming from like the COVID-19 engagement, how do you as a journalist process this information? Are you like, okay, they're having another Twitter disagreement, or are you looking at as something that is very substantial reflection of their policy and how they will communicate once they're elected to office?
The question is for me. I mean, I sometimes feel like watching the social media component of that campaign that I come away dumber than I was when I started. I mean, the crudité thing is cute and it's funny and it makes for great Twitter traffic, but it doesn't tell me where Mehmet Oz stands on economic issues. It doesn't tell me how John Fetterman might vote on a matter of international trade. And these are two men who are running for United States Senate. These are two men who, if elected, are going to be called upon to cast votes on some pretty weighty and substantial matters. And I think, Miracle, it's kind of, I mean, because this campaign has been so dominated by social media, it kind of speaks to the performativeness of our politics and where we are at the moment. It almost doesn't matter where you stand on things. It almost doesn't matter what your policy positions are, as long as you are glib and clever on Twitter, or as long as you can pull in a former Jersey Shore star to kind of, fight your campaign battles for you. I mean, I think if you ask the average voter where John Fetterman stands on economic issues, they would be hard pressed to give you an answer, but they could tell you exactly about the crudité thing. So it's, in some ways it works to his advantage, but it doesn't, and I'm going to again sound like a broken record, it doesn't necessarily result in a better informed electorate. It doesn't do voters any real favors, or frankly respect their intelligence all that much.
Interesting. Miracle, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I was going to say, because, as the policy person, there does seem to be a lot of policy missing, especially, with the U.S. Senate. You're also heavily focused and engaged in international issues, which is a huge, this differentiation between state representatives, city council, is this international component, and with so many things going on in the world, it's very important that you have those policies and that conversation. And so, do you think it's a little bit like too late to become more serious as we get to, head toward election day? Or do you think that this is what the one or two debates are going to reveal if and when they happen? Jonathan, Steve.
That one's for me. I mean, that is normally the purpose of a debate, so you can get the sense of the candidate, of where he might stand on matters of say relations with China or incursions into the South China Sea, where he might stand on tariffs and trades. I can infer where John Fetterman might stand based on what I know about him, and presume that he will take a traditionally Democratic position on this, but be able to really thoroughly sound him out on these issues is the purpose of debates. That is the purpose of in-depth interviews with candidates. And again, he has had that health issue that has kept him out of public view. And in some ways, some of this battle is being waged in television commercials, but on a lot of key stuff, I think, Miracle, I'm with you on this. I think voters are being deprived of that opportunity to find out where these two men really stand on stuff. I couldn't tell you where Mehmet Oz stands on any number of issues. I can infer, but in terms of the actual sort of granular policy stuff, I can't. And I do this kind of stuff all day long.
I guess what I'd say is that, at least with Fetterman, I think there are a few positions he sort of put out there, but it's always in a meme form. It's always in the form of a really pithy tweet, or his we know he supports legalizing marijuana because he made it a whole thing that he flew a banner from the Capitol, his Capitol balcony, and saying legalize it, and so, and he would say things like, I support the union way of life, and so that sort of it signals that okay, this guy's pro-organized labor, and he'll probably vote on stuff like that. But it's if you were looking for a meaty policy conversation that gets into the nitty-gritty of okay, but there are a lot of ways to legalize marijuana. I mean, there's also, you can decriminalize marijuana instead of legalize it fully. Do you want a state system? Do you want home grow? There's a lot of there's a nuanced policy conversation we had on what legalized marijuana looks like. And I think it maybe, is it too much to expect all of that to be fleshed out during a political campaign? Maybe we're asking too much as members of the press, but at the same time, knowing a little more than just John Fetterman believes legalize it is, I don't think it's crazy. Same thing can be said for Mehmet Oz. I've mostly, I've stayed away from that race, but same thing can be said for Doug Mastriano. He sometimes will blurt out details of a policy. A really good example of this would be his education policy on one of these, aforementioned radio interviews with a right-wing talk radio host. He said what he thought state's education funding should look like is slash the amount the state pays per student, more or less, to school districts by about $9,000, and then use that money and give it to parents for school choice. So, or basically just to use it however they want. This is a very common concept among right-wing conservative think tanks that oppose public education in a lot of ways. The idea is that money could go to a public school. It could also be used to get tuition to a private school or a charter school or whatever, school choice. And then Doug Mastriano, after the state's teachers union picked up on this, and there was some news attention, and they've started running a campaign to try and highlight, like Doug Mastriano said in this radio interview, wants to cut spending per student. And those were his words. I've listened to the interview. He's now tried to backtrack, saying there and on his website and comments say, no, the teachers unions are wrong. I want to keep school funding the same. I just also want more school choice. And in that, he sounds exactly like Josh Shapiro. Over the weekend when I was with him, I asked him about it because his website, which is a little more in depth when it comes to policy, but he says he supports school choice. He wants to keep funding the same, if not increase it, for public schools, but then also make sure that some parents have access to a charter school, private school, if they want that for their child. And that's what Shapiro said. So there kind of was this distinction that we saw, and then Mastriano has kind of tried to backtrack from it, say that's not accurate, and my feeling is, if we do get a debate in the governor's race, which we very well may not, both have, in particular, Doug Mastriano has put conditions on him being involved, which involves basically he picks his own moderator, Shapiro picks his own moderator. He kind of wants an openly partisan brawl, I would say, where each side can just pick whoever they want that they think fits their ideology and gets to ask the other person questions. If we ever even get that, I have a sense that there won't be a lot of nuanced policy debate about, well, what does Doug Mastriano's plan for public education look like? What does Josh Shapiro's plan for public education look like?
That's very interesting. And then just jumping back to the Senate race, at least from my vantage point, I'd be interested to see what you think, John. It did appear that and after the primary, and like you said, during the time that the Lieutenant Governor Fetterman was not on the campaign trail, it seemed for most of the summer they were able, to use a football term, because it is football season, to kind of run out a portion of the clock. But now it seems that, I don't know if it's just me, but now it seems that, in the wake of the Washington Post editorial, that was, very strident in its argument for Fetterman to make himself available for debate. It does seem that there has been a somewhat of a shifting of the tectonic plates, under this race, and more pressure does seem to be on the Fetterman campaign, more pressure than it seems like they felt they were under in July or August.
Yeah, I have a great deal of respect for the Washington Post editorial page. I doubt very seriously it's going to bring John Fetterman to his knees, unfortunately. Voters deserve more than one debate in this campaign, Gahar. They're not going to get it. They deserve They deserve a debate in the race for governor. And as Stephen said a moment ago, they're probably not going to get it. This is the age that, again, and I've been saying this throughout, this is the age that we find ourselves in now, where candidates try to minimize their exposure. This is something that Fetterman, this is not without precedent either. I mean, Fetterman sort of tried to minimize the number of debate appearances during the spring primary season. I think there was one down in Philadelphia where Malcolm Kenyatta went after him hard for not being there. Connor Lamb went after him hard for not being there. I understand why the candidates do that. I understand why candidates want to minimize their exposure. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna get now into this very late stage of the campaign before John Fetterman puts himself in front of the voters, and it's really not going to advance the conversation in any meaningful way.
Back to you, Marco.
Yeah, and we're talking about some of the impact of this election, and we're also, seeing that there is still very personal issues going on, whether it's school board races and people trying to remove people from school boards based on the books that they recommend, whether it is teachers failing to, support, queer and trans students. As you're doing some of this reporting, are there any of these social issues that you're seeing play out in real time as, this election, comes to a close in November, where a lot of these conversations are now impacting people's everyday lives? To you, Stephen, and you, John.
Yeah, so when I was out in Pittsburgh, I was covering some state legislative races. There's some 2 open seats north of Pittsburgh in the State House. It's the 30th and the 33rd. Really important races. And we're talking, like northern suburbs, McCandless, Sharpsburg, that the whole northern area of the North Hills. So, and I'm there, and I'm talking to one of the candidates, a Democratic candidate in one of those districts. He's a doctor, and he's running, and then a woman comes up to him and starts asking him for his position on abortion. And so same thing right off the bat. That was one of the first things she wanted to know. And he says, I support. I think that's a decision between a woman and a doctor. I think we should protect that. I think that the state should be held out of it. I didn't really catch her answer, but then she immediately jumped into, and what do you think about what do you think about the idea that there's more than two genders, or that people can change genders? Referencing all the talk about how should gender and sexuality be taught in schools, and the Democratic candidate Arvind Venkit was basically look, I think that it's a conversation that's being maybe a little driven by national media. I've seen my daughter's curriculum. I haven't seen much of this stuff mentioned. Trying to downplay it. And the woman was really kind of just kept pressing him on it and no, this is my most important issue. And I ended up talking to her after, and she wouldn't even give me her name. She was worried that people would come knock on her door if I quoted her, because they were concerned about her stance because they didn't like her stance on gender issues. So I guess I say this of I think that what we're going to see from Republicans is a lot of focus on some of these social issues that get talked about a lot. That on right wing media, we're gonna see talk about immigration. We're gonna see talk about schooling, about the idea that teachers are indoctrinating kids. I think this is going to be something that Republicans will use to try and label Democrats as extremists as much as Democrats label Republicans as extremists on issues like abortion and voting rights. And to me it looks like it's going to be a very it's a very emotional election, and that's something that I think it's not necessarily new, but it's looking like everyone's going to grab their wedge issue and use it to try and get people into their corner.
Stephen, thank you for that. And John, is there any other races, either at the congressional level or at the General Assembly level, that you think we should be paying attention to for us political junkies in all corners of Pennsylvania?
Sure. I think, Harry, before we move on to that, I just want to sort of dovetail on what Stephen said a moment ago. I was at my daughter's back to school night a couple of weeks ago, and had and I will come to this, I think, from the human side of this. I had a number of conversations with teachers about some of these issues, and you can see the fatigue in their faces. I mean, we come to this school year in the midst of an unprecedented teacher shortage across the Commonwealth, staff shortage, bus driver shortage. And I'm talking with teachers about these issues, and to a person, they are simply in the classrooms trying to do their jobs, trying to teach our kids what they need to know. And there are some of our children who are struggling with issues of identity. It's hard enough being a kid. I think it's probably an order of magnitude harder being a kid now, and who are just trying to do their jobs, even as they're being buffeted from all sides by the externalities of this superheated culture war. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the conversation as well, that on the other side of these policy debates are actual humans who are just trying to get through and who are just trying to get along. And that's the thing I was most struck by when I was having those conversations a week or so back. To your other question about much-watch races, I can think of 203 in the state house that bear attention, and 25 in the 50-member Senate that also bear attention. All of these races are determinative in their own way. Certainly Democrats are trying to make inroads in the state house. They're trying to make inroads in the state Senate. I think their chances and maybe Stephen, he's always closer to this than I, their chances are better in the former than they are in the latter. And then certainly we have a bunch of really good, several good congressional races, including one out in Western Pennsylvania between Mr. Delizio and Mr. Schaefer, that bears watching. That's that seat that Connor Lamb is giving up. That's a few that just rush immediately to mind.
Stephen, any other ones that you didn't talk about prior?
Yeah, I would say with Western PA, I mean, honestly, the North Hills are the center of the political universe, because you have obviously you have the statewide races that people are going to be voting in, but you have that congressional seat with Chris Delugio versus Jeremy Schaefer. You have the state Senate race, Lindsey Williams versus Lori Mizgorski, and then you have these two very competitive state house races. And yeah, I would say that the state legislative races are really going to be key. There's new maps. That changes everything. I'm truly looking to 2023 as like new legislature, new me. Everything's going to be different after, with a new governor, new maps, a huge amount of turnover. I do think if Democrats have a shot of flipping anything, it's probably the House, especially because of it really was like seismic changes with what the maps did in the lower chamber versus the upper chamber. So, looking ahead, it's really like a whole lot is up for grabs. And I think you can really see that by just looking at the races just to Pittsburgh's north.
Thank you. Miracle, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Is there any races that are I know, last time we were talking, we didn't know when our election season was going to be. We didn't know what was going to happen with the primary. So it was like different, like a different type of stress, right? So because I'm always like, politics is like stressful, but it's also fun. And sometimes there are candidates that, regardless of their politics, that you just like to watch. It's going to just be just a fun segment. Is there any candidates like for you, either one of you, this go about? And if you don't want to say it, if you don't want to name names, it's fine as well.
See how diplomatically they remain silent on that. I will. I think I'll say this, Miracle. I mean, as somebody who's been watching all of this for an awfully long time, all of it's important. All of these candidates, many of these candidates are interesting in their own ways. Some in more positive ways than others, and some less so. But it's the deadline to register. I'll put in my sort of my good citizen pitch. The deadline to register to vote is not too many days away. So if people want to have a say in all of these very important races up and down the ballot, they should get out there and register, and then cast their ballot however they choose, whether by mail-in or in person on election day. I mean, every election is consequential. This one feels more consequential than most.
I guess I'll say, now that I think about this, I worry there's some confusion out there. Vote by mail is still intact. You can still vote by mail in this election if you want. The deadline for that is going to apply is, I believe, a week before Election Day. So that will be like November 1st. If I'm wrong, please someone yell at me. But that is, if I'm remembering correctly. So vote by mail. There's been a lot of rhetoric. There's been a lot of politics. That is still a thing that you can do in Pennsylvania. So if you have any concern that you won't be free on Election Day, if you don't like voting in your polling place, if you're worried about lines, if for whatever reason you want, there is no restriction on it. You can still vote by mail in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Thank you for that. And in our last few minutes, I did want to take an opportunity to talk about some of the recent pieces that you both wrote, starting with John, with your piece in the wake of Biden's speech about the state of our democracy. Why did that speech strike such a chord with you? And what was kind of the Cliff Notes version of what you were trying to get across in your editorial?
Oof, that feels like a lifetime ago now in our politics, Gary. And I think it is really what I've been saying throughout the course of our conversation here. I mean, our democracy is seems cliche to say it, but is at an inflection point. We're presented with starkly different choices about who we want to be as a country, about who we want to be as a people. Do we want to sort of continue the grand spirit of the experiment that started in Philadelphia all those decades ago, or do we embrace this darker, more authoritarian strain that seems to be emerging in our politics right now? The president, it felt to me, was challenging us to embrace our better angels and to choose to walk with that democratic and more egalitarian heritage. I mean, a democracy is something that's easy to take for granted, but is awfully hard to recover when it's gone. And I think, particularly since 2016, particularly since the events at the Capitol in 2021, that is something that bears paying attention to, and is a message I think that bears repeating.
Thank you for that. And Stephen, you wrote a piece about the Wolf administration expanding access to voter registration forms. Do you give us a breakdown of what that means, and how does that change from past policy of the Wolf administration and administrations prior?
Yeah, so what I think has to be said is that the Wolf administration has really been trying to focus on voting rights and an expansion of that. So you can register to vote online if you're watching this. Presumably you have access to the internet. So you could just, if you Google online voter registration in Pennsylvania, a link will pop up. But obviously not everyone has access to the internet. Not everyone thinks to Google things. And already there are federal laws and state laws that mean that when you go to, the DMV, when you go to a county assistant's office, if you go to some other state services, they can also give you the form to register to vote. And what the Wolf administration did, they announced this about I believe 2 weeks ago as part of this whole initiative saying this is voter registration month in Pennsylvania, is they said we're expanding the amount of places we're going to offer voter registration forms. So now they added them to state-run veterans' homes. They added them to state park offices. They added them to career link centers, which are basically state workforce development centers, or places you can go if you're out of work and you can go there and try and find a job. And they're also bringing, voter registration forms to these community jails. I'm lacking on a better term for it, but it's basically meant to be a place where people who are near the end of their sentence go to sort of have 1 foot in, 1 foot out of time of being incarcerated. So, and they're going to provide voter registration forms there. I believe the Wolf administration's estimate was about 2 million Pennsylvanians aren't registered to vote. And the first step to voting is being registered. There are a ton of people who are registered to vote don't vote. That's what we're doing when we say the voter turnout was 30%. Well, that's 30% of registered voters, but there's still people who are old enough, who are eligible to vote, and don't, and just aren't even registered to. And there's a whole lot of reasons we can get into about why people might not want to engage in politics these days. We probably just spent about an hour talking about it, but the number one thing to start with, it's just registering to vote. And these forms now that let you do it, if you don't have access to the internet, they're going to be in more places and available to more people.
Thank you. And I said one quick thing, jumping back to John, a recent story you wrote, and then Miracle will be able to bring us home. You recently wrote a story about upsurge in trolls, particularly targeting the LGBT community. Could you talk a little bit more about that and some of the ramifications of what this report found?
This was a particularly disturbing study, Kahari, by the Human Rights Campaign and the Center for Countering Digital Hate, finding what one reasonably assumes to be true, but is borne out in pretty stark data, that online trolls, some of them anonymous, some of them fairly prominent public officials and public figures and elected officials, sort of trafficking in online hate against LGBTQ plus individuals. And that, as is so often the case, this stuff that manifests tragically the case, the stuff that manifests itself online finds itself out there in the real world. One example being cited was was a so-called drag queen story hour at a library in the Bay Area. where some hard right activists came in and began hurling many of the slurs at this person that you see online. And one of the slurs that is used is this myth that LGBTQ people are so-called groomers, that they recruit young people into the lifestyle or into the identity, which is so hateful that it barely bears repeating, but unfortunately has now become sort of the most prevalent form of hate online against LGBTQ people. And the tweets that mentioned it get reshared and elevated and reshared until it become, frankly, an offensively commonplace part of the online conversation. And the study by the Human Rights Campaign and the Center for Countering Digital Hate really drove this home in a very vivid way. And it is a reminder that we need to step up and confront this kind of speech when we see it in our midst, against whomever it's deployed. But in this particular case, it's our LGBTQ friends and neighbors.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think it's very important, especially we know that a lot of times the most vulnerable people are targeted, whether it's our queer community or migrant community. They get targeted first, and then it expands and snares other folks. So I want to thank you both for sitting down with us on this Power Hour. My last question is, November 8th is election day. How do you decide which election night coverage party to go to? Like, what is, because I know everyone, you're on different beats, things happen, but what is that thought process into going and deciding, or do you just try to pick all the ones that are in the area that you are? Steven and
John. That's a great question. I definitely, I'm not gonna lie. One of my first is which is closest. It's a long night. It's a night where I usually want to end in my bed, even if that's at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. I want to end it in my bed, hopefully, in a familiar place. So, I usually look for something closest to Harrisburg. I also think, honestly, between COVID and the really slow counting of mail-in ballots, even the fun of a good election night party, I feel like it's been kind of robbed from us. You got to be careful about what race is called, what you can even say is the result, because of how long it takes to count mail-in ballots. And obviously with COVID, people were having gatherings, so not to be a buzzkill, but man, I haven't been to one in a couple of years, so hopefully I'll just find some people some people who will let me in close to Harrisburg and have a good time there.
Yeah, well, I will say there was a few $1 million sent out. So people are supposed to be counting their mail-in ballots starting at 7 a.m. this election. So maybe you might have to create a schedule this year. John?
Yeah, that used to be a lot more fun in the old days where you could stay out all night. I used to think I'm trying to find the candidate that was farthest away for that, because I loved a good field trip, and the chance to do some reporting out in the field. But as Steven says, it's a lot different now. You can't be in big rooms with people because you might end up testing positive for COVID. There's the uncertainty of the results. I think that's probably a decision that we're going to make, Miracle, as we get closer into election night. It's a conversation I've already started having with my staff about the most efficient way of allocating our very limited resources, and it may just come down to, as Steven says, whoever is the closest to Harrisburg gets to be the winner that night. The winner of our coverage, not necessarily the winner of the election.
All right, well, thank you both. We're so happy you took this time out for this Monday evening to join us. I hope you have a good rest of your night and a good rest of your weekend. I hope no more crazy, controversial stories come out of Pennsylvania, at least for this week, so you get a little bit of rest, a little more, news coverage this week.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much again. And that was Steven Caruso from Spotlight PA and John Micek from the Pennsylvania Capital Star. giving us just a lot of great insight on this whole just amazing election cycle, one of the most historic election cycles in the history of the state. And we got, really, really, really great insight from two folks who have been watching it very closely. So we hope to hear from them again before election night. It's kind of apropos that at 8:08 p.m. on tonight, we wrap up with two of the finest political journalists in the state, because 50 nights from now, the polls will have been closed for 8 minutes. It is 50 days out tonight. So how apropos is that? We got 50 days into the election. As Miracle has said so many times before, the voter registration deadline is October 24th. Election day is Tuesday, November 8th. We have candidates for governor, lieutenant governor. Of course, they run as a ticket. U.S. Senate, Congress, Pennsylvania State Senate, and Pennsylvania State House are on the ballot. We have 50 days, literally 50 days from now. At this moment, the polls will have been closed for less than 10 minutes, and they will be counting the votes. So it's a very, very interesting time as we get down, to the waning days. But before we do that, I did want to give an opportunity to give a proper shout out to everybody that supported protecting our freedom. I know we have some cool photos that were taken, and we had a good time. A lot of powerful speeches were given. Like I said, Mayor Gainey, Josh Shapiro, Chris DeLuzio, Summer Lee, and Senator Lindsey Williams, and also Sarah Innamorato, Bethany Hallam, and City Controller Michael Lamb were in the house. And obviously, shouts out to Ben the Ark, and shouts out to Pennsylvania United. So before we go, we did just want to give an opportunity as we look at some of the photos from yesterday's event in the Highland Park section of Pittsburgh. So I wanted to definitely give a shout out to everybody who was involved. There is going to be another one coming up at a location yet to be determined on Sunday, October 23rd, where I think we're even going to make it bigger, because if my scheduling is correct, that's going to be a Steeler night game. So we're not going to be rushed like we were to really wrap up around noon, so folks could get home and watch the Steeler game. That will not be an issue at the next Protecting Our Freedom Day of Action, because the Steeler game is at 8:20 that night. Again, thank you, Stephen Caruso. Thank you, John Micek, from joining us. Miracle, do you have anything else? Well, I guess there's a couple other announcements. I guess we're going to go a little bit over our usual time. You want to talk a little bit about people power and politics coming up this weekend.
Yes, so this Saturday, we have People Power and Politics with One Hood Media Academy, which is C3, with David Banner. But the cool thing about this is, outside of the basketball tournaments and the food, we're going to be having an expungement and pardoning clinic. We know that recently the Governor Wolf announced this marijuana pardon project. So we'll have some attorneys on hand to walk you through that paperwork. On top of that, we'll have some information about the general pardons and expungement process, because we understand the majority of people in Allegheny County that are impacted by marijuana convictions or have a marijuana record are not going to be eligible for this project. So for the people who are come out, the paperwork will have technology to help you as well as attorneys. But please come out, this weekend to learn about information about not only the candidates, but how these pardon processes can impact you. And if you're like, what's a pardon? What's an expungement? Do not worry, because on Thursday, right here, right at One Hood Media at 7 p.m. is Ask a Black Lawyer, which I host, and we'll be talking about the criminal justice process with two amazing legal advocates, as well as an individual, individual who fought his own case after being sentenced to life in prison, and just give you some motivation and encouragement of why it's so important to get involved in the political process. And, reminder, October 24th, the last day to register to vote. November 1st is the last day to request a mail-in ballot. However, with issues in the mail, we are asking people, please, 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 try to request your mail-in ballot no later than October 25th. And the reason why, we don't want any delays in the mail. We don't want anyone denied the right to vote because they're waiting on a mail-in ballot. Please, 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 if you want to vote by mail, do it now, request the ballot now, and make sure you sign front and back, sign and date, and make sure the signature on your license matches the signature on the envelopes. And we're talking about a very special power hour for next week. I'm going to turn it over to Kahari.
Yes, we're very excited to announce tonight that next Monday's Power Hour is going to be from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Next Monday, there's going to be a very historic meeting that is hosted by the Pennsylvania Black Chamber of Commerce. They are hosting the Pennsylvania Black Mayors Alliance, the first of its kind. 18 African American mayors from across the state of Pennsylvania are going to meet. They're being convened by co-chairs Mayor Ed Gainey from the city of Pittsburgh and Wanda Williams from the city of Harrisburg. We are going to be on hand, and next Monday's Power Hour is going to be a special mayor's roundtable where we're going to have a small representation of the larger group of 18 sit down with us for an hour and talk about everything they talked about. They will talk about during the day on Monday, September 26th, and also whatever future plans they have for this new alliance of Black mayors from around the state. And we have mayors representing places like the city of Gettysburg, the city of Williamsport, excuse me, of course, Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, and cities in the eastern part of the Commonwealth, central part of the Commonwealth, as well as the western part of the Commonwealth. So we're looking forward to a very, very insightful conversation within a very interesting emerging group, again, being led by Mayor Ed Gainey out of Pittsburgh and Mayor Wanda Williams out of Harrisburg. So please tune in next Monday night for our special One Hood Power Hour from the Pennsylvania Black Mayors Alliance meeting.
And with that, enjoy your Monday night.
Good night. Thanks for joining us.